3I Atlas just sent its first signal, and U.S. leaders are retreating to bunkers. Only 3 confirmed objects from outside our solar system have ever been detected. The first was weird. The second was normal. The third just triggered continuity of government protocols. 3I Atlas is broadcasting a narrow-band signal with mechanical precision, displaying symmetrical jets that defy cometary physics and timing its activities to Earth's position, as if it knows we're watching. Within days of detection, senior officials relocated to secure military facilities, nuclear testing resumed after 3 decades, and classified threat assessments began treating an astronomical object like a national security emergency. Stay until the end to understand why the convergence of these events suggests we're not dealing with a comet anymore. Something arrived, something responded, and someone decided bunkers were suddenly necessary. A narrow-band hydroxyl emission, pulsing from the direction of 3I Atlas, the third confirmed interstellar object ever detected crossing through our solar system. The signal repeated with mechanical precision, every 11.3 hours, matching the rotation of the object itself. Now, you might think, so what? Comets outgas all the time. But here's the thing. Comets are messy. They spew gas in every direction, creating broad, chaotic emission profiles across multiple frequencies. This signal was different. It was clean, narrow, repeating, almost like someone had tuned a radio station in the void between stars. The spectrogram looked wrong from the first moment scientists pulled it up on their monitors. When you model a spinning comet nucleus, you expect brightness variations, sure, but you also expect chaos. Outgassing vents appear, disappear, change intensity as ice sublimates unevenly. What the radio telescopes were picking up from Atlas showed none of that natural disorder. The modulation was too stable, too perfect, like a lighthouse beam sweeping across an empty ocean. Some researchers started using a word in their private communications that rarely appears in professional astronomy: artificial. Within 36 hours of that first signal detection, something extraordinary happened in Washington. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, relocated to secure military housing. Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, did the same. Kristi Noem, Homeland Security Secretary, moved into facilities designed for wartime continuity of government. Stephen Miller, Senior Advisor, followed. These weren't announced relocations, no press releases, no standard security drill notifications. The housing they moved into is typically restricted to one scenario: the complete breakdown of civilian government infrastructure. Nuclear war, catastrophic attack, existential emergency. The timestamps tell the story that officials won't. The first hydroxyl signal from Atlas appeared in observatory data at approximately 1400 hours Universal Time Coordinated on October 24th. The relocation orders, according to fragmented reports from multiple sources, began processing around 0200 hours on October 26th, less than 2 days. In government terms, particularly from movements involving the highest levels of national security apparatus, that's instantaneous, that's scrambling. 3I Atlas had been discovered back on July 1st, 2025, by the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System Telescope Array in Chile. The name Atlas also carries the designation C/2025N1 in the Comet Classification System. From the moment astronomers calculated its trajectory, they knew they were looking at something special. The orbit was hyperbolic, meaning this object didn't originate in our solar system. It came from somewhere else, somewhere out in the galaxy, and it was just passing through on a one-time cosmic flyby. Only 2 other confirmed interstellar objects had ever been detected before Atlas arrived: 1I/Oumuamua in 2017 and 2I/Borisov in 2019. 3 visitors in 8 years. 3 chances to study material chemistry physics from beyond our stellar neighborhood. But here's what makes Atlas different from its predecessors. Oumuamua was weird, sure, with its strange acceleration and cigar shape. Borisov looked and acted like a normal comet, just one that happened to come from another star system. Atlas, though, Atlas started talking. Or at least that's what the signal suggested to anyone willing to entertain the idea. The hydroxyl line emission was coming from a specific region of the electromagnetic spectrum, the same region where interstellar clouds and star-forming regions naturally emit. Except interstellar clouds don't rotate every 11 hours. They don't produce signals that sync up with mechanical precision to an object's spin. Radio observatories from Australia to South Africa to New Mexico all confirmed the detection within 72 hours. The verification process moved faster than normal peer review because the implications were simply too significant to sit on. Spectrometers isolated the frequency, cross-referenced it against known natural sources, ran simulations of possible chemical outgassing scenarios. Every model that relied purely on natural processes produced results that didn't quite fit. There was always something left over, some residual pattern in the data that natural explanations couldn't account for. The signal was too narrow, too periodic, too clean. Meanwhile, satellite imagery began showing unusual activity around classified military installations near Washington, D.C. Joint Base Anacostia Balling saw increased convoy traffic. Fort McNair, a facility that houses senior defense officials during continuity operations, showed heat signatures consistent with full occupancy when it's normally maintained at minimal staffing. Raven Rock Mountain Complex, the Pentagon's alternate command center, buried inside a mountain in Pennsylvania, reportedly went to elevated operational status. None of this information came through official channels. It leaked through flight tracking apps, through logistics contractors, through the kinds of digital breadcrumbs the 21st century infrastructure leaves everywhere. The question that started circulating in both scientific and intelligence communities was deceptively simple. What do these two events have to do with each other? A cosmic visitor begins broadcasting a repeating signal, and within days, the upper echelons of American government activate protocols designed for civilizational survival. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe the cabinet relocations were planned weeks in advance for unrelated reasons. Maybe the signal from Atlas is just a weird but ultimately natural phenomenon that scientists will explain once they gather more data. But the timing feels too precise, too synchronized, like watching two completely separate machines suddenly lock into the same rhythm. If this was routine security posture, if this was just another comet passing through the inner solar system, why did the most powerful officials in one of the world's most powerful nations suddenly decide that secure bunkers were the appropriate place to be? What did they know that the public wasn't being told? And more unsettling, what were they preparing for? October 31st, 2025. 7 days after the signal, the Trump administration announced the end of a 33-year moratorium on underground nuclear testing. American nuclear devices would once again be detonated beneath the Nevada desert, something that hadn't happened since 1992. The official explanation centered on strategic readiness, maintaining the arsenal, ensuring reliability of aging warheads. Standard deterrence language. Except the timing wasn't standard at all. Policy changes of this magnitude typically take months of planning, congressional briefings, international diplomatic preparations. This decision appeared to materialize in days. Satellite imagery captured convoys moving toward the Nevada National Security Site, the modern name for what used to be called the Nevada Test Site. Trucks carrying specialized diagnostic equipment, crews setting up monitoring stations, security perimeters expanding around underground test shafts that hadn't been active in decades. The logistical footprint of preparing for a nuclear detonation is enormous. You need seismographic arrays, radiation monitoring stations, evacuation protocols for nearby areas, coordination with international treaty monitoring organizations. The fact that all of this began mobilizing within a week of the Atlas signal detection suggests that either the planning had been underway for some time, or someone made an extraordinarily fast decision that nuclear testing needed to resume immediately. Defense analysts around the world tried to make sense of the announcement through conventional frameworks. Was this aimed at Russia, demonstrating resolve after years of deteriorating arms control treaties? Was it signaling to China that American nuclear capabilities remained credible? Those interpretations made sense on the surface, but they didn't explain the timing.
Nuclear posturing typically follows diplomatic breakdowns, failed negotiations, specific provocations. There hadn't been any recent trigger events in the weeks before October 31st. Relations with Russia and China were tense, sure, but no more tense than they'd been for years. Something else was driving the decision. A document began circulating in certain online communities that allegedly originated from within the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. The authenticity couldn't be verified, and multiple media organizations tried and failed to confirm its legitimacy.
The memo referenced something called subcritical diagnostics under magnetospheric variability and radiation hardening verification in interplanet solar storm context. The language was technical, bureaucratic, the kind of jargon that gets used in highly specialized fields where normal words don't quite capture the concepts. If genuine, the memo suggested that the nuclear testing wasn't about weapons reliability in the traditional sense. It was about understanding how nuclear devices and their support infrastructure would function during unusual electromagnetic conditions.
It's filled with the sun's magnetic field, with charged particles streaming outward in the solar wind, with complex interactions between planets in the interplanetary medium. When something like Atlas, an interstellar object possibly emitting regular radio pulses, moves through that environment, it could theoretically interact with existing magnetic fields in ways we've never observed. Could those interactions create unusual electromagnetic phenomena? Could they affect Earth's magnetosphere? And if they could, would that represent the kind of threat that requires immediate preparation to ensure critical infrastructure, including nuclear command and control systems, remains functional? The connection between the Atlas signal and nuclear testing requires accepting a premise that sounds almost absurd on its face, that an object millions of miles away, an icy or rocky body roughly 5 kilometers across, could somehow pose enough of a threat to Earth's electronic infrastructure that the United States government decided it needed to verify its nuclear arsenal would function properly under potentially disturbed electromagnetic conditions. Yet that interpretation, as unlikely as it sounds, actually fits the observable data better than the conventional explanation. If this was routine strategic readiness aimed at terrestrial adversaries, why announce it so abruptly? Why not use the standard months-long process of international notification and diplomatic positioning? Historical precedent offers some context. The United States has only broken testing moratoriums under conditions of perceived existential threat. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, while not ratified by the U.S., has been honored in practice since the early 1990s. Breaking that decades-long pattern signals something fundamental shifting in threat assessment. Decision-makers concluded that whatever risk emerged in late October 2025 was severe enough to justify the diplomatic, environmental, and political costs of resuming underground detonations. The layered nature of the response becomes clearer when you place nuclear testing alongside the cabinet relocations. You have continuity of government protocols activated, moving senior officials into secure facilities. You have nuclear test preparations beginning within days. These are two of the most serious emergency responses available in the American national security infrastructure. They get deployed for scenarios like imminent nuclear war, massive cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, or catastrophic natural disasters on a civilization-threatening scale. The question becomes, what scenario encompasses both space phenomena and national security infrastructure that would trigger this kind of response? Some researchers began looking at historical analogs, searching for previous instances where cosmic events intersected with military preparedness. The 1962 Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear test had been partly motivated by curiosity about how nuclear detonations would behave in space, particularly regarding electromagnetic pulse effects. The Soviet Union had conducted similar tests. Both superpowers wanted to understand how nuclear weapons would function in environments very different from terrestrial conditions. Was something similar happening now?
Was the Atlas signal, whatever it represented, prompting a new round of testing to verify infrastructure resilience against an electromagnetic threat from space? The alternative explanation, that these events were merely coincidental, becomes harder to maintain the more you examine the timeline. October 24th, first signal detection. October 26th, cabinet relocations begin. October 31st, nuclear testing moratorium ends. 7 days. 3 major escalations in national security posture, each one representing protocols that normally require extensive planning and authorization. Either the most remarkable coincidence in modern American history was unfolding, or the Atlas signal had triggered a pre-existing contingency plan that very few people knew existed. A plan for what happens when something from outside the solar system starts behaving in ways that suggest intelligence or threat, or both. Russia's announcement that it might resume its own nuclear testing, following the American decision by less than 48 hours, added another layer. Were they responding to American strategic positioning, or were they responding to the same underlying threat that had motivated the American decision? The Russian space agency had been tracking Atlas since its discovery. Their telescopes had presumably detected the same anomalous signal. If the American government had concluded that Atlas represented some kind of space environment threat, it's entirely plausible that Russian analysis had reached similar conclusions. 2 nuclear powers, ostensibly rivals, simultaneously deciding that nuclear test readiness was necessary, not as posturing against each other, but as preparation for something else entirely. If you're watching from the outside, trying to piece together what's happening from fragmentary news reports and leaked documents and unexplained policy shifts, you're left with an uncomfortable conclusion. The governments with the best sensors, the most sophisticated monitoring systems, the deepest scientific expertise appear to be treating an interstellar object as more than a scientific curiosity. They're treating it as something that requires the most serious emergency protocols in their arsenal. The nuclear dimension isn't about demonstrating strength to other nations. It's about making sure that when whatever comes next actually happens, the fundamental systems of state power will still function. The object designated 3I Atlas, also carrying the comet classifications C/2025N1, came from the direction of Sagittarius, roughly toward the galactic center. Its trajectory was hyperbolic, with an eccentricity well above 1.0, mathematical proof that it didn't originate anywhere in our solar system. Something somewhere out in the galaxy either ejected this object from another star's orbit, or it formed in interstellar space itself, then wandered for who knows how long before gravity caught it and pulled it toward our sun. NASA's upper estimate placed its diameter at approximately 5.6 kilometers, though some observations suggested it could be smaller. For reference, that's big enough to cause continental devastation if it hit Earth, but small enough that it would be essentially invisible to the naked eye at the distances it was traveling. What caught astronomers' attention immediately after perihelion, the closest approach to the Sun, was the symmetry. Comets approaching the Sun typically develop asymmetric outgassing patterns. As solar radiation heats the surface, volatile materials sublimate, creating jets that erupt wherever the ice or frozen gases happen to be concentrated. These jets push the comet around, creating unpredictable changes in trajectory. Oumuamua had shown exactly this kind of behavior, a mysterious acceleration that was eventually attributed to outgassing jets, though some researchers remain skeptical of that explanation. Atlas, though, developed symmetrical jets, multiple plumes of material arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate geometry rather than random thermal processes. More puzzling, some of the jets appeared to be pointing toward the Sun. That's backwards. Radiation pressure in the solar wind should push material away from the Sun, creating the classic comet tail. Sunward jets require some kind of active process, something generating enough thrust to overcome the Sun's outward pressure. Natural explanations existed for this phenomenon, but they all required very specific conditions.
rotating ice bodies with vents that happen to align perfectly with the rotation axis, sublimation on the sunward side creating reactive thrust, complex tumbling that cycled different surfaces through periods of intense heating. All possible, all requiring remarkable coincidences. Then came the polarization data. When light scatters off a comet's surface and dust cloud, it becomes polarized, and the degree of polarization tells you about the material properties.
Fluffy, irregular dust particles create positive polarization. Smooth, regular surfaces create negative polarization. Atlas showed negative polarization in certain observations consistent with something smooth, possibly metallic, definitely not the typical icy rubble pile that comets are made of. Speculative? Absolutely. But combined with the symmetrical jets and the radio signal, the polarization data added another piece to a puzzle that wasn't fitting together in any conventional way. The comparison with previous interstellar visitors becomes instructive. 2I/Borisov looked and acted exactly like a comet should. It had a nucleus, a coma of gas and dust, a tail. Its composition matched cometary ices and organics. It behaved chaotically, outgassing unpredictably, changing brightness in ways consistent with the tumbling chunk of dirty ice. If you wanted to know what a normal interstellar comet looked like, Borisov was your answer. Oumuamua was weirder. Its elongated shape, its strange acceleration, its lack of a visible coma, despite clear evidence of outgassing, all suggested something unusual. Some researchers proposed it might be a fragment of an exoplanet. Others suggested it could be a hydrogen iceberg. A few, including respected scientists like Avi Loeb from Harvard, suggested it might be artificial, a probe or derelict from another civilization. That hypothesis remained deeply controversial, but it hadn't been definitively ruled out. Atlas occupied a middle ground. It looked more like a comet than Oumuamua did, with clear signs of outgassing and dust production. But its behavior was too ordered, too systematic. If you wanted to design a spacecraft that could masquerade as a comet, you'd give it ice and dust to create a plausible disguise. You'd arrange your propulsion or orientation system to look like natural jets. You'd time your maneuvers to coincide with perihelion, when solar heating would provide cover for any artificial activity. You'd make it look almost natural, just off enough that anyone paying close attention would notice the discrepancies, but not so obvious that it would scream artificial. Spectroscopic analyses detected nickel emission lines early in Atlas's approach. Nickel isn't unusual in cometary composition, but the abundance was higher than typical. More intriguingly, some analyses suggested the object might have formed around 7 billion years ago, predating our Sun's formation by over 2 billion years. If true, Atlas could contain material from the early galaxy, from an era when star formation rates were much higher and the chemistry of the interstellar medium was different. The thick disk stellar population, old stars with unusual chemical signatures, might have hosted the planetary system or molecular cloud where Atlas originated. Every new piece of data opened more questions than it answered. Computer simulations of controlled venting offered an alternative framework for understanding the symmetrical jets. If you wanted to maintain a stable rotation and specific orientation relative to the Sun, you could use carefully timed gas releases to act as thrusters. Point some jets sunward to slow your spin, point others anti-sunward to maintain angular momentum, adjust the timing to lock on to the Sun's magnetic field vector. The physics worked. The engineering was within known capabilities for any civilization that could build interstellar probes. Whether nature could produce the same outcome through pure chance and chemistry remained the central question. The mirror body hypothesis emerged from trying to explain multiple anomalies at once. Suppose Atlas had a highly reflective shell, something with an albedo much higher than typical cometary surfaces. Suppose that shell was somehow oriented to maintain a specific angle relative to the Sun, using the solar magnetic field as a reference frame.
You'd get consistent solar-facing jets from sublimating ice underneath the shell. You'd get negative polarization from the smooth reflective surface. You'd get stable rotation if the shell was balanced properly. Again, possible in nature? Maybe. More likely with engineering? Probably. The hydroxyl emission that started this whole cascade of events fit into the picture in disturbing ways. Hydroxyl emissions are common in comets, produced when water molecules break apart under ultraviolet radiation. But narrowband emissions require a very specific physical process. You need a coherent source, something that's producing photons at a precise frequency rather than a broad spectrum. In nature, masers, the microwave equivalent of lasers, can produce narrow-band emissions. But cometary masers are rare, and they don't typically show the kind of periodicity that Atlas was displaying. The 11.3-hour repetition matched the rotation period too perfectly. Every time the object completed one spin, the signal peaked. Every time. No variation, no drift. Just mechanical consistency. Claims began circulating online about phase-encoded structure within the hydroxyl line. Suggestions that the signal wasn't just a repeating pulse, but contained information in the timing variations. None of these claims had been peer-reviewed. None had been confirmed by major observatories. They lived in the space between detection and interpretation, the frontier where speculation runs ahead of verification. But the claims wouldn't die. Amateur radio astronomers with access to university telescopes started their own observations. Some reported seeing the same patterns. Others saw nothing unusual. The scientific process ground forward slowly, while public attention accelerated ahead. Near perihelion, Atlas reached its closest approach to the Sun and survived intact. Comets sometimes disintegrate at perihelion when thermal stress fractures their structure. Sun-grazing comets rarely survive their first pass. Atlas not only survived, but emerged with its symmetry intact, its rotation stable, its signal still broadcasting. Whatever it was made of, whatever held it together, was robust enough to withstand the kind of thermal environment that destroys most cometary nuclei. Another anomaly, another data point that fit better with engineered resilience than natural fragility. Trajectories showed Atlas would make its closest approach to Earth in early November. Not dangerously close, nothing that posed an impact risk, but close enough for detailed observations with large telescopes. Close enough that if it was trying to communicate, Earth would be well within range. The timing of the government relocations and nuclear testing preparations suddenly made more sense in that context. If something was going to happen, if Atlas was going to do something more than just emit periodic signals, Earth's closest approach would be the logical moment. That window was when officials decided secure bunkers were the appropriate place to be. Continuity of government protocols in the United States trace their origins to the early Cold War, to a time when nuclear annihilation felt not just possible, but likely. The concept was simple but profound. If Washington was destroyed in a first strike, the machinery of government had to keep functioning. Someone had to maintain command of nuclear forces, manage emergency response, coordinate survival efforts for whatever remained of the nation. Facilities were built, deep underground or inside mountains, stocked with communications equipment, supplies, redundant power systems, everything needed to run a country from a bunker while the surface burned. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center sits 74 miles west of Washington, buried inside a mountain in Virginia. It's been operational since the 1950s, continually upgraded with each generation of technology. Raven Rock Mountain Complex, located in Pennsylvania near the Maryland border, serves as an alternate command center for the Pentagon. Fort McNair, in Washington itself, has secure facilities capable of housing senior officials during emergencies. Joint Base Anacostia Bolling offers another layer of secure infrastructure. This network of bunkers and fortified installations forms the skeleton on which American government would hang if everything above ground stopped functioning. The protocols for activating these facilities exist on a spectrum. Low-level activation might mean increased readiness, staff on call,
supplies checked and refreshed. Medium activation brings some officials to secure locations for exercises or during heightened threat periods.
Full activation, the kind reserved for genuine existential emergencies, means the entire continuity apparatus spins up. Senior officials relocate, communications networks switch to backup systems, command authority disperses across multiple sites to ensure redundancy. The October 2025 relocations appeared to be somewhere between medium and full activation, serious enough to physically move cabinet-level officials, but not quite the total dispersal that all-out war would trigger. Public documentation of these movements was thin. The Secret Service doesn't announce when it moves protectees to secure locations. The Pentagon doesn't publish real-time updates on continuity operations.
What information emerged came through fragments. Flight tracking data showing increased traffic to Joint Base Andrews. Vehicle convoys spotted near Fort McNair. Logistics contractors reporting unusual activity at facilities normally maintained at minimal staffing. The picture that emerged was incomplete but consistent. People who normally worked in downtown Washington offices were suddenly somewhere else, somewhere fortified, somewhere designed to survive catastrophe. What made the October relocations unusual wasn't just that they happened, but what they were responding to. Traditional continuity protocols activate in response to clear threats: nuclear war, massive cyber attack, pandemic, natural disaster on a civilization-ending scale.
Each of those scenarios has observable warning signs. Intelligence picks up enemy preparations for war. Cybersecurity notices intrusions. Disease surveillance catches outbreak patterns. Seismologists monitor volcanic activity or asteroid trajectories. The government has frameworks for understanding these threats and protocols for responding to them. But what framework existed for an interstellar object emitting periodic radio signals? Where in the threat matrix did that scenario fit? Leaked documents, their authenticity unverifiable, but their technical language convincing, suggested new threat classifications had been added to continuity planning. Terms like interstellar electromagnetic disturbance and space-to-ground continuity appeared in what were claimed to be internal memoranda. The documents described scenarios where electromagnetic phenomena originating from beyond Earth's orbit could affect ground infrastructure. Not through kinetic impact, not through radiation in the traditional sense, but through subtle interactions with magnetic fields, with the ionosphere, with the electromagnetic environment that modern technology depends on. If genuine, these documents suggested the planning community had already war-gamed scenarios involving exactly the kind of object Atlas appeared to be.
Former military planners, some speaking on background to journalists, some posting in semi-public forums, began discussing new threat tables. The Cold War threat matrix was binary: us versus them, missiles and megatons, deterrence through assured destruction. The post-Cold War era added terrorism, cyber warfare, biological threats, hybrid warfare. Now, according to these sources, the threat table included categories for space environment disruptions. Not asteroids, those were already covered. Not solar storms, those had their own protocols.
This was something new, the possibility that intentional signals or activities from beyond Earth could interact with terrestrial systems in ways that posed national security threats. Speculation focused on the rotation period and timing of the Atlas signal. If the object was deliberately broadcasting, timing those broadcasts to coincide with Earth's position in its orbit would be trivial for any intelligence capable of interstellar navigation. The signal could be designed to interact with Earth's magnetosphere, to probe our electromagnetic environment, to test whether anyone was listening and capable of understanding what they were hearing. Each rotation brought another pulse, another opportunity for interaction, another test. From a continuity of government perspective, that created a difficult problem. How do you prepare for a threat you don't understand, can't physically intercept, and can't negotiate with? The infrastructure response suggested someone had decided that preparation was possible even without understanding. DEFCON, the Defense Condition Alert System, operates on classified procedures that rarely leak. But monitoring services that track military communications noted increased traffic during early November, the period when Atlas was making its closest approach to Earth. Whether this represented a change in DEFCON level or just heightened operational tempo remained unclear. Either interpretation suggested the military was taking the situation seriously enough to alter its readiness posture. Alternative explanations existed and deserved consideration. Perhaps the relocations were planned weeks in advance for reasons unrelated to Atlas, and the timing was coincidental. Perhaps a separate classified threat had emerged, something terrestrial and conventional, that happened to occur during the same week Atlas was drawing scientific attention.
Perhaps the whole thing was elaborate security theater, a drill meant to test continuity systems, but dressed up with enough secrecy to make it look real. Any of these explanations could account for the observable facts. None of them explain the timing quite as neatly as the hypothesis that someone in the national security establishment had concluded Atlas represented a threat significant enough to activate protocols designed for civilization-ending scenarios. What struck observers who followed these events was the silence. No public statements from the White House explaining the relocations.
No Pentagon briefings on the nuclear testing decision beyond the bare minimum. No NASA press conferences discussing the anomalous observations from Atlas. The normal machinery of government communication, the press releases and background briefings and official statements, went quiet on these topics. Questions from journalists hit walls of no comment and classification. The contrast with how government typically handles major decisions was stark. When you want public support for a policy, you explain it. When you're managing information about something you don't want public attention on, you say nothing and hope the story dies from lack of feeding. The pattern that emerged looked less like preparation for war against another nation and more like preparation for something that didn't fit existing categories. You don't activate continuity protocols against Russia or China unless you expect imminent nuclear exchange. You don't end nuclear testing moratoriums unless you need to verify something about your arsenal. You don't relocate senior officials unless you think their current locations might become untenable. Taken together, these actions suggested threat assessment pointing towards something novel, something the existing playbook didn't quite cover. Whether that something was Atlas itself or just our first direct contact with phenomena we'd never encountered before remained the central unknown. November 5th through 7th, 2025. The signal changed. Radio observatories in Australia reported that the hydroxyl emission from Atlas had shifted, doubling in frequency while maintaining its periodic structure. Other facilities confirmed the observation within hours. Whatever had been broadcasting at one frequency for weeks had suddenly switched to a harmonic, like a musical note jumping an octave. The rotation period remained constant at 11.3 hours, but the signal itself had evolved, adding complexity to what was already an unexplained phenomenon. Large telescope observations during this period reported something else: weak metallic reflectance bands in the spectrum. The James Webb Space Telescope, though not primarily designed for solar system observations, had been tasked with taking a few exposures of Atlas as it passed through its optimal viewing window. The preliminary data, not yet peer-reviewed, suggested spectral features consistent with processed metals, elements that shouldn't exist in high concentrations in a natural comet. Iron, nickel, chromium, elements that require high-temperature processing to concentrate, elements you'd expect in industrial waste or manufactured structures, not in icy bodies that formed in the cold depths of interstellar space. International observatories added their own pieces to the puzzle. Russian facilities reported detecting extremely low-frequency anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances in the ELF range, timed roughly to Atlas's rotation. Chinese observers noted similar patterns. The interpretation being circulated quietly among researchers was response harmonics, the idea that Atlas's signal was interacting with Earth's magnetosphere and creating secondary effects detectable from the ground. Physics supported this possibility. Earth's magnetic field acts like a giant antenna, capable of capturing and resonating with electromagnetic radiation across a wide spectrum. If Atlas was broadcasting at the right frequencies, Earth itself might be responding, creating detectable patterns in the very low frequency bands that penetrate deep into the crust and oceans. A memorandum, allegedly from the National Security Agency, began circulating in encrypted channels frequented by intelligence community watchers. The document, labeled Atlas as a non-hostile periodic emitter, suggesting analysis had concluded the object posed no immediate kinetic threat but required monitoring due to its unusual behavior.
The classification marking on the document, if genuine, indicated it was from a special access program, the kind of compartmented intelligence that operates beyond normal classification levels. Verification proved impossible. The NSA doesn't confirm or deny leaked documents. The language used in the memo matched standard intelligence community style, but that proved nothing. Sophisticated forgeries could replicate bureaucratic language easily enough. Comparisons to previous unexplained signal detections became inevitable. The SETI community maintains archives of anomalous detections, signals that briefly looked promising before being identified as terrestrial interference or natural astrophysical phenomena.
The famous WOW signal from 1977 remained unexplained decades later, though most researchers had concluded it was probably natural. In 2024, several unexplained signals from the previous decades had been quietly reclassified as solar or Earth-bound interference after more sophisticated analyses. The pattern suggested that most mysteries eventually resolved into prosaic explanations given enough time and data. But some didn't. Some remained genuinely anomalous even after exhaustive investigation. The three competing interpretations of Atlas began crystallizing into distinct frameworks among researchers and analysts trying to make sense of the accumulating data.
The natural hypothesis held that all observed phenomena, while unusual, fell within the bounds of known physics applied to an extreme case. Atlas could be a comet with an unusual composition and rotation state that created the appearance of artificial behavior through coincidence. The signal could be a natural maser effect, amplified by the object's geometry. The symmetrical jets could result from specific thermal and rotational conditions. This interpretation required no new physics, no revolutionary discoveries, just nature being weird in ways we hadn't seen before. The artifact hypothesis proposed that Atlas was manufactured, either a probe sent deliberately toward our solar system or a derelict piece of ancient technology tumbling through the galaxy. The periodic signal could be a beacon designed to attract attention from any technological civilization capable of detecting it. The metallic spectral features could be structural materials or shielding. These symmetrical jets could be attitude control systems maintaining the object's orientation. This interpretation required accepting that we weren't alone, that someone else built machines capable of crossing interstellar distances, and that one of those machines had found its way to us. Revolutionary implications, but not outside the bounds of plausibility given the observable data. The containment hypothesis suggested governments knew significantly more than public information indicated and were actively managing the situation. This framework explained the rapid policy responses, the classified threat assessments, the reluctance to share data publicly. If Atlas represented first contact or evidence of non-human intelligence, the diplomatic, religious, economic, and social implications would be profound enough that careful information management would be essential. The relocations and nuclear readiness could be precautionary measures against public panic or infrastructure disruption if the story broke in an uncontrolled way. This interpretation made sense of the government behavior, but required assuming a level of coordination across agencies and international boundaries that was hard to maintain in practice. Social media amplified the speculation into territory that ranged from insightful to absurd. Claims about Fibonacci sequences encoded in the signal timing spread rapidly based on amateur analysis of publicly available data. The math was questionable, but the underlying idea that the signal might contain structured information remained plausible. Reports of the signal broadcasting at 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line frequency that SETI had long considered a likely choice for interstellar communication, proved to be misunderstandings of the hydroxyl line frequency, which was related but distinct. The Internet's tendency to round rough numbers into significant patterns created false precision that real researchers had to constantly debunk. The psychological dimension became as interesting as the scientific one. Within weeks, public perception of Atlas had shifted from just another comet to potentially the most significant astronomical discovery in human history.
Opinion surveys showed increasing percentages of people believed Atlas was artificial, despite no peer-reviewed studies confirming that hypothesis. The speed of the narrative shift reflected how much cultural preparation had already happened through decades of science fiction, SETI projects, and UFO discourse. The idea that we might not be alone wasn't shocking anymore. People were psychologically ready for that revelation, perhaps even expecting it. NASA's relative silence on the anomalies fueled rather than dampened speculation.
When the agency did release statements, they were carefully worded to emphasize the preliminary nature of all observations and the need for peer review before drawing conclusions. This was standard scientific practice, the appropriate response to unusual data that hadn't yet been fully analyzed. But to observers primed to see cover-up, the caution looked like evasion. Why wasn't NASA holding daily press conferences? Why weren't they mobilizing every telescope to study this object? The answer that scientists needed time to verify observations and rule out instrumental effects before making dramatic claims wasn't satisfying to people who wanted immediate answers.
China's space agency released images of Atlas captured by instruments on their Mars orbiter as the object passed through the inner solar system. The images showed a bright, compact object with asymmetric features that could have been jets or surface irregularities. Chinese researchers published preliminary analyses suggesting the object's brightness variations were consistent with a rotating irregular body, but didn't speculate on composition or origin. The decision to release this data publicly while American agencies remained largely silent created diplomatic tensions, with suggestions that different governments had different policies on transparency regarding potential non-terrestrial intelligence.
Visual representations of the data became almost artistic. Spectrograms overlaid with spacecraft silhouettes, illustrations showing Atlas against backdrops of secure bunkers, animations of the signal interacting with Earth's magnetic field lines. The imagery conveyed the magnitude of what was potentially at stake. Humanity possibly hearing something from beyond our world. Our governments responding as if that something posed a threat. The future balanced between discovery and danger. Whether any of this imagery accurately represented reality remained uncertain. We were hearing something, detecting something, observing something that didn't fit normal patterns.
What it meant, where it came from, what it wanted, if it wanted anything at all, those questions remained unanswered. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the presence of the signal itself. Radio emissions from space are common. Pulsars broadcast with mechanical regularity. Magnetars burst with enormous energy. The cosmos is filled with electromagnetic noise.
Either someone on Earth knew to expect this and had prepared response protocols in advance, or the object itself was timing its activities to coincide with specific geometric relationships between it and our planet. Both possibilities implied intention, intelligence, planning. Natural phenomena don't care about Earth's position relative to an incoming comet. Natural phenomena don't trigger cabinet relocations and nuclear test preparations. We were confronting something that appeared to be responsive, aware, deliberate, in ways that rocks and ice shouldn't be.
The phrase being used in private conversations among scientists captures the existential weight.
Maybe it wasn't a call to us. Maybe it was a roll call we just happened to overhear. The idea that the signal wasn't meant for humanity specifically, but was instead a general broadcast, a lighthouse sweeping the galaxy looking for anyone listening, somehow made it more profound. We weren't chosen. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right technology to detect something that had probably been happening for ages.
How many other signals had passed through our solar system before we developed radio astronomy? How many conversations had we missed because we weren't yet capable of listening? November 9th, 2025. Convoys rolled through the Nevada desert under cover of darkness, satellite tracking services noting unusual military transport activity around the Nevada National Security Site. NORAD logged increased alert status publicly labeled as test readiness exercises, though the timing remained conspicuous. Telescope arrays across the northern hemisphere pivoted westward, tracking Atlas as it began its outbound journey, accelerating back toward interstellar space.
News feeds flashed constant updates. Interstellar visitor, mysterious signals, government preparations. Each headline adding another piece to a puzzle that refused to resolve into a coherent picture. 3 interpretations had emerged from weeks of observation, analysis, and speculation, each with adherents among scientists and analysts trying to understand what they were witnessing. The natural comet hypothesis remained the default position for most of the astronomical community. Atlas was extreme, but still fundamentally natural, a cosmic accident that happened to produce features that looked artificial to observers primed by decades of science fiction to see intelligence in unusual patterns.
Physics would eventually explain the symmetrical jets through specific thermal models. The radio signal would resolve into a natural maser phenomenon amplified by the object's geometry and composition. The timing with government actions would turn out to be coincidental, responses to classified terrestrial threats that happened to overlap with Atlas's passage. Supporting evidence for the natural hypothesis included the fact that comets are genuinely weird objects. The appearance of one comet that pushed the boundaries of observed behavior didn't require invoking alien technology. It just required acknowledging that our models of cometary physics might not cover every possible case. The hydroxyl emission, while unusual in its narrowness, could result from specific chemical processes in an unusual ice matrix. The metallic spectral features could be natural metal concentrations that formed during the object's creation billions of years ago. Everything unusual about Atlas had potential natural explanations. They required specific conditions, multiple coincidences, unusual circumstances, but nothing impossible. The artifact hypothesis represented the revolutionary interpretation, the one that required accepting humanity was no longer alone in the universe. Atlas was a manufactured object, a probe sent either deliberately toward our solar system or randomly into the galaxy to find anyone capable of detecting it. The periodic signal was a beacon, broadcasting on frequencies that indicated technological origin. The symmetrical jets were propulsion or attitude control. The survival of perihelion passage indicated engineered thermal protection beyond what natural materials could provide. The timing of signal changes during Earth's closest approach suggested responsive behavior and awareness of observation. Evidence supporting the artifact hypothesis accumulated uncomfortably. The signal's narrow-band characteristics matched what SETI researchers had long predicted artificial signals would look like. The rotational stability through perihelion suggested internal structure beyond a rubble pile. The apparent shift in signal frequency during closest approach to Earth implied responsive behavior. Most tellingly, the government response made more sense if officials had concluded they were dealing with technology rather than nature. You don't activate continuity of government protocols for weird comets. You activate them for potential threats to civilization. If intelligence agencies had determined Atlas was artificial, even with low confidence, that determination alone would justify the observed preparations. The containment hypothesis occupied middle ground, arguing that regardless of whether Atlas was natural or artificial,
Governments had decided to treat it as a managed information problem. The scientific uncertainty created space for worst-case planning. If there was even a 10% chance Atlas was artificial, a 5% chance it posed a threat, that was enough to justify precautionary measures. The relocations, the nuclear testing, the classified threat assessments all made sense as hedging against low-probability but high-consequence scenarios.
This interpretation explained why public information remained limited. Uncertainty plus potential for social disruption equals information control. Better to wait until more data was available before making definitive public statements that could trigger panic. Meta-analysis of the government response suggested threat assessment operating on multiple levels. The continuity posture indicated concern about infrastructure disruption. The nuclear testing suggested concern about electromagnetic effects on weapon systems. The international coordination, evidenced by Russian and Chinese observations being shared through back channels, if not publicly, suggested recognition that whatever Atlas represented transcended national boundaries.
These weren't the actions of a government managing a purely scientific event. These were the actions of a government preparing for potential crisis while hoping the preparation would prove unnecessary. Hypothetical scenarios being discussed in security planning circles, according to sources willing to speak off the record, included Atlas's signal synchronizing with solar magnetosphere coupling events. The Sun's magnetic field and Earth's magnetosphere interact constantly, creating complex dynamics that affect everything from satellite operations to power grid stability. If Atlas was deliberately or accidentally broadcasting at frequencies that resonated with these systems, the effects could range from minor disturbances to major infrastructure disruptions. Nuclear test readiness in this context made sense as verification that hardened military systems, designed to survive electromagnetic pulses from nuclear explosions, would remain functional if space weather effects exceeded normal parameters. The evidence suggesting this scenario included the timing of solar activity during late October and early November. The Sun had been relatively quiet, no major flares or coronal mass ejections, yet geomagnetic indicators showed unusual variations correlating with Atlas's rotation period.
Space weather monitoring stations detected low-amplitude oscillations in Earth's magnetic field that matched the 11.3-hour signal periodicity. These effects were subtle, barely above background noise, but their correlation with Atlas was statistically significant enough to warrant attention. Whether the object was causing these effects or merely coinciding with natural variations remained uncertain, but the correlation was there. Global participation in Atlas observations revealed divergent approaches to transparency. The European Space Agency released detailed astrometric data, helping refine the object's trajectory and physical parameters. Japan's space agency shared spectroscopic observations that confirmed unusual compositional features. India's growing space program contributed infrared observations that helped constrain the object's size and temperature. The international scientific community was functioning as it should, sharing data and collaborating on analysis. But the disconnect between scientific openness and governmental silence created tension. Scientists wanted to discuss their findings publicly. Security agencies wanted information controlled until better understanding emerged. The gap between these imperatives widened as more anomalous data accumulated. China's decision to release Mars orbiter images publicly represented a calculated choice in this information environment. By sharing visual data showing Atlas's unusual features, Chinese officials demonstrated technical capability while potentially pressuring other nations to reciprocate with their own observations. The images showed what appeared to be surface features inconsistent with typical cometary morphology, regions that maintained consistent reflectivity across the object's rotation, suggesting either unusual composition or actual structures. Interpretations varied wildly, from interesting geological features to possible manufactured surfaces, with no consensus emerging. NASA's measured response, often criticized as too cautious,
actually followed established protocols for extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. The agency had been burned before by premature announcements that later proved incorrect.
The famous 1996 announcement of possible Martian microfossils in meteorite ALH 40001, later largely discredited, taught lessons about the importance of thorough verification before making dramatic claims. With ATLAS, NASA was taking the time to verify observations through multiple instruments, rule out instrumental artifacts, and build a comprehensive data set before drawing conclusions. This was good science. It was also frustratingly slow for a public hungry for answers. The emotional landscape of discovery played out across social media, news coverage, and public discourse. Initial excitement about an interstellar visitor gave way to confusion about anomalous behavior, then anxiety about government preparations, then a kind of existential anticipation. Something significant was happening, or about to happen. Whether that something was humanity's first contact with alien intelligence, a major space weather event, or just an unusual natural phenomenon being misinterpreted remained uncertain. The uncertainty itself became the story, the waiting, the watching, the collective holding of breath. Philosophical implications emerged in conversations among scientists and commentators.
If Atlas was artificial, if it represented technology from another civilization, what did that mean for humanity's place in the cosmos? The Copernican principle, the idea that we're not special or central, would receive its ultimate confirmation. We would become one technological species among presumably many late arrivals to a galaxy that had been hosting intelligence for billions of years. If Atlas was natural, but it triggered this level of government response, what did that say about how prepared we were for genuinely novel cosmic phenomena?
Either interpretation suggested humanity stood at a threshold, looking across towards something that would change how we understood ourselves and our universe. The timeline's convergence remained its most compelling feature. October 24th, signal detection. October 26th, relocations. October 31st, nuclear testing. November 5th through 7th, signal changes. November 9th, uncertain present tense. Each event followed logically from what preceded it, building a narrative that suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate causation. The timing was too tight, too synchronized to easily dismiss as random occurrence. Something connected these events beyond mere correlation. Whether that connection was human decision-making responding to perceived threat or external influence from Atlas itself, or both, remained the central unknown. Multiple researchers noted that if Atlas's signal had been designed to elicit exactly this kind of response, to demonstrate its artificial nature without being overtly threatening, the design was brilliant. A clearly artificial radio beacon might provoke immediate hostile responses from nervous governments. A signal that could plausibly be natural, but was just unusual enough to trigger investigation, would encourage study rather than aggression. The symmetrical jets, the metallic spectroscopy, the periodic broadcasts all provided evidence without proof, suggestion without certainty. If you were announcing your presence to a civilization for the first time, creating ambiguity might be the safest approach. As of November 9th, the signal had ceased. Atlas had passed its closest approach to Earth and was accelerating outward, heading back toward interstellar space. The hydroxyl emissions that had started the entire cascade of events were no longer detectable above background noise. Either the object had stopped broadcasting, or it was now too distant for our instruments to pick up the signal clearly. The silence felt almost as significant as the signal had been. If Atlas had been trying to communicate something, if its behavior during perihelion passage had been deliberate, then its return to silence suggested the message, whatever it was, had been delivered. The question of what happens next didn't have a clear answer. Atlas would continue outbound for years, gradually fading from observability
as distance and the sun's glare made detailed observations impossible. Scientists would continue analyzing the data already collected, writing papers, debating interpretations, building models. Governments would presumably continue whatever preparations they'd begun, though those activities would remain largely invisible to public view. The social conversation about what Atlas represented would continue evolving, shaped by whatever information emerged from scientific analysis and whatever governments chose to reveal. Maybe it wasn't a call to us. Maybe it was a roll call we just happened to overhear. The possibility that the signal wasn't meant as communication, but simply as identification, a cosmic version of pinging a network to see what responds, reframed everything. We detected something, we responded by pointing every telescope we had at it, by activating emergency protocols, by taking the possibility of first contact seriously even while maintaining scientific skepticism. That response itself might have been the data Atlas was collecting. Not what we are, but how we react. Not our technology, but our readiness to acknowledge we might not be alone. The spectrogram image lingered on screens in observatories around the world, that narrow spike of hydroxyl emission rising above the noise floor, repeating with mechanical precision every 11.3 hours until it didn't anymore. The data remained. The mystery persisted. The implications, whether Atlas was natural or artificial, whether the government response was justified or overreaction, whether we had just witnessed first contact or merely unusual astronomy, would take years to fully process. What we knew for certain was this: something from beyond our solar system had passed through, had behaved in ways we couldn't fully explain, and had triggered responses from our most powerful institutions that suggested they took the anomaly as seriously as any threat they'd ever faced. What happens next is up to us to watch. The cosmos had spoken, or at least broadcast. Humanity had listened, had responded, had prepared. Whether that was the beginning of a longer conversation, the end of a brief anomaly, or something we didn't yet have frameworks to understand, would only become clear with time. The date stamp on the final clear signal detection read November 9th, 2025. The story, whatever it ultimately meant, was just beginning.